Energy sabotage. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, welcome back Alex, who's raising some concerns around energy policy in Australia and has some ideas of what we're going to need to do about that. How are you going, Alex?
I am going well. How are you?
Good. Now, I always ask you your opinion. What would you solve? What's your big issue? How would you attack it? And boy, did you let us know your opinion on that today. It was an excellent piece, really,
I
that
have been
delved into this.
I've been deliberating on it since you and I first spoke about it because I hate red tape. There's all sorts of things I hate. But then I listened to a really good speech by Matt Barrie, and it actually, I think it all goes back to when we started stuffing up our energy policy.
Uh, a great one to dive into today. Let's start off with the big picture on this. Really, a lot of what you wrote revolves around energy security and the economic impact of that. You mentioned that we've sort of gone through a period of security being destroyed, and that's an underlying factor of our economy, our manufacturing industry, how all that fits together. Do you maybe want to give us that big picture overview of the policies, decisions that you believe ultimately were most detrimental?
So obviously I'm pro manufacturing, so that is me, and so people can tear me apart on that. But ultimately, I think countries need to be self-sufficient in things, and I think we need to be experts in things.
Hmm.
Now, solar is just one example where we have these universities that produce these engineers that are world-leading engineers in solar, and we just give that technology to China and import back in the solar panels. So we're not using what we're making as far as research and development. And if you look at, when we were actually a manufacturing powerhouse in around the 1970s, it made up 25% of our economy. And we're now down to 5, now 5 or 5.8, I think. So that may sound okay to everyone, but the average is around 15. We are lagging the world. We're not only lagging developed countries, we're lagging undeveloped countries. Like we are just destroying, what we're making, I guess. So I think at some point we need to decide what a good number is, whether that's 10%, 15% back with the average, and what can we do to make it happen? And what have we done to destroy 20% of the economy? What have we done?
And it's an interesting angle to look at because it sort of happened over a long period of time. So people don't necessarily see it unfolding as it was. Like we weren't necessarily paying attention to how that all sort of slipped away. But turning that conversation, sort of going down that path, you made some global comparisons and you really looked at Germany in particular, that transition away from nuclear energy and the consequences that it had for industrial output. Do you think there's some lessons that we can learn from that?
Well, let's just look at what's happened to Europe in the last 5 years and what's happened to America in the last 5 years. America decided that energy security was something they needed. They invested in oil. Whether or not you believe in global warming, I do. But so oil is probably not the path you want to take. But then let's look at Germany on the other side. They got rid of all their nuclear power. So Germany was an industrial powerhouse and was leading Europe for the last 2 decades. Got rid of all their energy. Then the Ukraine war happens, and now their industry is shutting down. Their output I think last year was one of the worst they've had. And the US is onshoring everything with their energy security. So look at what two different countries are doing. Look at how their economies are going and look at what they did. Germany went green, and they went green when the technology wasn't there, and they shut down existing infrastructure and made their energy prices so much more expensive they couldn't compete. And America didn't go green, could have done other things, but chose for energy security. And their economy is booming compared to the rest of the world. So you don't need to look too far to see some pretty solid examples that the energy security is proper, and cheap, affordable energy is what drives a country's industry. And Australia is paying $12.50 a gigajoule for gas because the government has said that's the highest we can pay, and the rest of the world is paying $2. Now, interestingly, look at Japan, who imports all of their, all of their gas from us, they sell half of that gas to other people. So they are importing it at $2 a gigajoule. We're paying $12 and they're exporting it. So tell me what we're doing wrong here.
And I think it's really important to highlight that you're not taking that you're not taking the anti-green argument at all here. Like, you're just talking about practicality of how we manage that transition. And I think something you just said, where you were highlighting the technology's not there, is really important to understand. And it's important for people to get their head around. You can't just make a binary argument here, because to argue that we need to go 100% renewables when the technology doesn't exist to allow that to happen today is problematic. I mean, you highlight in the article the mathematical limits of renewables. We have intermittent wind, solar, batteries aren't up to the level yet to be able to mitigate all of that. How do we balance that, or how do you provide more balance around that to land potentially somewhere in the middle of those policy examples that you've given?
Well, as the largest coal is the thing that makes Australia the most money in the world, yet we won't build a coal plant. So the irony of it, if you were really green, if we were green, we wouldn't export the coal, but we don't. We don't choose to do that. So it's hypocrisy at its best that the government's happy to take billions of dollars in taxes from coal companies and then turn around and say we're green. The fact that we export so much coal probably makes us the least green country in the world. So let's start with, okay, coal's out, but the rest of the world's going to use it. So whatever, let's park that aside. Gas, we are either the highest or the second highest exporter of gas in the world. Now, gas is often, because it can be turned on and off for energy generation, is often spoken about as probably the best transitional energy source, but we've sold all of that. So, Dutton has suggested nuclear, and everything says nuclear is probably the best transitional, non-polluting, well, non-carbon emitting energy, cheap. Do you know we are the only G20 country in the world that doesn't use nuclear power? Like the whole thing, and we have 31% of uranium in the world. So we own the resource, we don't use it, we don't want coal, but we export it, and we're talking about 75% renewables, which is a mathematical impossibility. We're at 20% now, and if you look at the graph on, the makeup of coal dropping, gas climbing, renewables climbing, we're pretty steady. It's starting to plateau. There's not much more we can do. The grid doesn't support it. It's not working. We do not have a proper policy.
And that is really important, that anything that you're deciding to do as a country, any policy framework that you have, is based on mathematical factors.
Certainty
That
and
like, it has
facts.
to be reality, right? Like, what you're saying is reality. It's quite important as a foundation for framework. Surely, it doesn't always seem to go that way, but I think the final question I have is around that, right? Like, we've got public perception and we've got political will. They're two things that seem to be forming the backdrop of why this is a problem. We've got, you highlight the term one-term politicians, this idea that you've got corporate biases, you've got politicians who are very concerned about being re-elected, so they're not prepared to necessarily make the big tough decisions. And when public perception is sort of split on this because no one's really put a solid view forward, how do we deal with that? How do we make this political discord open, that people are starting to think about it and actually understand some of that logic, some of that maths behind the basics there? What's your view on that? How do we make this a mix that actually can work and get the political will to back that?
Well, at the end, let's just start with one thing. A voice is nothing unless it knows what it's talking about. Australia has a great, and it's more and more around the world, I guess, but we have engineers that are super smart, and yet we have a voice from an engineer who says you're wrong. And the public perception is nuclear isn't green, But then we've got experts in the area that turn around and say it's the most green option we have. So let's just start with stop listening to people that don't have a degree or at least a very good understanding of what happens. There was a guy, and this is worth watching, a scientist by the name of Robert Parker, who is a nuclear scientist. He's got all sorts of degrees. He started off as a civil engineer, so he had an engineering background and then was interested in nuclear and went and got a degree in it. Now, he was meant to talk about 2 or 3 months ago for Engineers Australia on nuclear energy and how it could support Australia's energy transition. Peter Holmes Accord, who I don't know if he's got an engineering degree, but he certainly doesn't have one in nuclear science, got up and said, basically stop confusing things. Renewables are the way to go. Now, he invests in renewables, so he's not an expert. Why did his voice stop Robert Parker making that speech? They actually cancelled his speech, which is insane. So if you can't let the experts talk and have an opinion, then what are we going to have? Well, we have one-term politicians who listen to people who are biased or have corporate interests. And because of that, this country is failing in understanding what we need to do, number one, two, implementing it, and three, getting a strategy that's not more than a year old. It took us, I think we started selling our electricity assets in the 1990s. 2010, Keneally sold the New South Wales grid. 20 years to sell it, and yet we cannot get a policy that works out a year from here. So, it was 20 years destroying something. Well, it's going to take 20 years to rebuild something. And unless we start getting experts that are allowed to talk, allowed to be heard, and allowed to be argued with, we're not going to get a proper solution.
Well, look, Alex, I threw it out there. I said, what do you think? What should we do? How do we fix this stuff? And you came back with all guns blazing on that one today. Absolutely wonderful discussion, and just appreciate all your background work on that and